Topic I wanted to speak about officially today is ribbis Bieno leben עצמו. Ribbis that a person lends to himself. What does that mean? What am I talking about? I'm going to take money out of one pocket and put it into the other pocket, and now I have to repay the first pocket. But I own both pockets. It's one pair of pants. They both belong to me. So can I lend myself ribbis and pay back a loan with ribbis and pay back the ribbis? Is there any problem? Or maybe the problem is that I need to be institutionalized, But beyond that, would there be any other issues? So yeah.
Maybe you could just clarify, why would someone want to do that?
So let's talk about that a little bit. So the Gemara in Bava Metzia and Daf Samach Tes on the base, as we've mentioned before, says Lo Asur Torah Ela Ribbis Haba Mi Lo V'Lamalve. What the Torah prohibits is ribbis that comes from a lovet to a malve. So we've described already how very often, in order to determine whether a certain transaction is going to be permitted or forbidden, you have to define different whether somebody is a lovet and whether somebody is a malve. We said, according to Rav Moshe, maybe only if you have shibud or gufa you consider to be a lovet, not just shibud nechasim. We've had a number of discussions about that. A malve also, does it have to be bailim yuduim even to count as a malve? So we have a whole bunch of different questions as to how we define lova and malve. But it also sounds very much that if I did have a situation where it would otherwise be ribbis, for example, it has to be ba'a milova l'malve. It has to go from one individual who's a love to another individual who is a malve. So it sounds very much, even from the simple statement and expression of our foundational rule, the basic principle of ribbis, that I need one individual who's a love, and I need a separate individual who's a malve. So what type of question would it be? When would it arise? It's to be asked that you would have a person who's going to take out a loan from himself and pay it back to himself. It would seem like that's not even a shaila to get off the ground, that of course it should be mutter, but no, why would you even do such a thing? So it could be that you have two separate entities, really, but they both belong to the same person. Like, for example, or they have the same identity. Let's say I have a small S corporation that I've incorporated for a small little company because I don't want to have personal liability, but it's all me. I'm the sole owner, the equity owner, the only member, the only director, the only manager, the only collector of dividends, profits. The whole thing is me, myself, and I. And it's a small, tiny little S corporation, but I need some money, so I'm borrowing personally money from that corporation. I'm going to pay it back to the corporation. Everything has to be done in a proper fashion when you're going to engage in a corporate transaction, even if it's an entity owned by myself. I have to document it. I have to show a proper amount of interest was charged, and now I'm going to take the loan, use it for my personal purposes. I'm going to pay it back, but there's nobody else I'm paying it back. There's no other person that I'm paying it back to other than myself. Another scenario, which is a common scenario, is that I'm in need of some money. Maybe I want to buy some real estate in Eretz Yisrael or something, and I need some extra cash, but I'm not terribly liquid right now. We're all raising children, paying tuition, whatever. What money does anybody have? The only money most people have nowadays, if they're not looking to, it's nice you can collect money selling your house, but then you'll be living in the street, so you have to use the money to buy a different house. So you can't really use that money. You could take a second mortgage on your house, get some money that way, presumably, but most people already took the second mortgages, so that's not an option anymore. So the main option will be that you're going to want to take money maybe out of your pension account. You'll borrow money out of your pension. It's like a little penalty that you might have to pay and so forth, but you need the money very badly, so you could take money from your pension account. The pension account is completely yours in terms of your entitlements to the pension account. You're not sharing it, al pi pashtus, with other people. You have to look at the pension plan, but the way that it works in many situations is that it's just all your money. But there are governmental federal laws about it, how much money, first of all, you're allowed to borrow from your pension account, and the manner in which you can borrow from your pension account. You have to pay back the money with interest. You're going to be the beneficiary of the interest. You might end up having to be, taxed to that interest and so forth, but nonetheless, and you might have to subject yourself to what we call double taxation, but that's a side issue. In terms of the entity that you're paying, you're basically paying yourself. So is this something which is permissible? Do we say, no, it's an interest transaction? Do we say, what interest transaction? But I'm basically paying myself. So these would be the types of circumstances that could arise. There are circumstances that are more complicated where you have like a family corporation that you're borrowing from. There, it's a little bit more straightforward that it's a problem if there are more people than just yourself in the corporation. You have yourself and and a child, so you're also borrowing from and paying back the child. So then already for sure, looks like we have issues. But the truth of the matter is that the main source for the discussion on these particular shilos comes specifically from this type of situation where there is a child involved in the picture. What is that? It starts off with the Mishnah in Shabbos. The Mishnah in Shabbos on Daf Kuf Mem Ches Amud Beis talks about how certain things that you can't do on Shabbos around the table, you like playing games and stuff because of the fact that you're going to violate various issur rabbanan. You're going to split, you're going to have lots, you're going to draw the lots, who's going to get different pieces of cake. Different pieces of cake, they look like they're more or less the same size, but one might be a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, one might have a little bit more apple inside the crust, might have a little tastier crust than the other, whatever. So are you allowed to get involved in splitting, food, playing these types of games? Somebody answers this question, they get this piece of cake, they answer a lesser question, they get a smaller piece of cake. So what types of activities of this sort are allowed? So the Mishnah says, Meifis Adamim Banavim B'nei Beiso ala Shulchan. You can play these types of games and give out the different pieces and so forth, but they should be roughly, to the best of your ability, they should be roughly equal pieces of chicken, cake, pie, whatever they are. The Mishnah sounds like, but you can't give bigger pieces corresponding to smaller pieces. Now, it could be that they're all putting their pieces into a pie, like everybody started out with various pieces that were given to them, and now we say, before everybody eats them, we're going to put them together, and we're going to give out and apportion them based on, whoever gets the best answers, or, whoever wins some contest. So that's the Mishnah. So the Gemara then has a discussion regarding this Mishnah in which it seems to both explain what the potential issurim are, and also potentially maybe even expand the heter when dealing with their children. First of all, why does the Mishnah talk about this is with your bana b'nei beso? Who are b'nei beso? Okay, bana maybe your wife. B'nei beso can include your wife, maybe daughters. Bana b'nei beso, different interpretations. What it means? Some say b'nei beso could be the people who are smukim al shulchano. Doesn't even have to be children. It could be the people who are effectively your children. They're like the boarders who live in your house and they're dependent upon you. So in bana b'nei beso in mimachir lo. So we say that why is it only on these individuals that we're makel that we allow these games to be played? So my timer, Rav Yona Reiss. So he says the reason is because of the concern that was expressed by Rav Yehuda Amashmur, which is what? He says, when you have people who are not close relatives, so then everybody is always angling to get a little bit more than the other. This person has an office which is a little tiny, which is a half an inch bigger than my office. How come I didn't get the bigger office? You know what it is, whatever. I spent some time in academia, so that's the way it is. So people, they if they're not, close relatives, so they're not going to be mevater in anything. Every single tiny little thing is going to make a difference. This person's piece of apple pie looks, fresher than my piece of apple pie. So therefore, so they're going to, if they're going to have these types of apportionments, so everyone's going to be makpid to weigh and to measure and to count, and you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Unless it's for a mitzvah, this isn't for a mitzvah, so you wouldn't be allowed to do those things. It's an issur d'rabbanan, uvdin d'chol, can't do it. Mishim lovin and purin, b'yom tov, and also if it's a lashon hava, that so you're going to be lending your piece of cake to be part of this middle tray where pieces are going to be apportioned, and you use a lashon hava as opposed to a lashon shelo, so that's also an issur on Shabbos. L'chadivrei beis Hillel ap mishum ribbis. So here you're wondering what is the connection to our sugya. So according to Beis Hillel, it's also a violation of ribbis. That somebody was started out with a smaller piece that they put into the pile, and now they're going to end up, because of the way the pieces end up getting apportioned, they end up with a bigger piece. So then it's a violation of ribbis. So says the Gemara, if it's a violation of ribbis, so then I don't understand why it would be permissible for your own family members. You prove too much. You explain the problem when they're not family members. I understand that family members are not makbid, so I don't have to worry about mida mishkal minyan, and non-family members I do have to worry about mida mishkal minyan. But once I'm talking about ribbis, ribbis is not a question of hakpada. Ribbis is just us. People aren't makbid at all. Ribbis is us. You gave a little, and somebody's obligated to give you more back. So that's a problem with ribbis. So bano v'nei veiso nami. So says the Gemara, no. Bano v'nei veiso hainu time k'd Rav Yona Reiss. The reason why that's permissible is because of Rav's din. What's Rav's din? And this is how the Gemara in Shabbos kind of ends up. The Gemara in Shabbos ends up saying that this is going to be perfectly permissible. The Amar Yehuda Marav, mutar lahavos banu v'nei veiso b'ribbis k'dei latim antam ribbis. You're allowed to do what? Don't look at me. I just know how to read a Gemara straight. To me, mutar lahavos banu v'nei veiso b'ribbis, if I was translating it, so I would translate, you're allowed to loan, make a loan to your children. You're allowed to make a loan to your sons, to your daughters, to your wife. Ribbis, especially here, it must be talking about small children. Banu v'nei veiso, your sons and your daughters, you can loan them ribbis, k'dei la'atiman tam ribbis, so that they would understand, kind of like what you're educating them. You're giving them chinuch. They should see how tough it is. Oh, look, I'm going to make a loan to them, and they have to pay me back what I gave them plus a little bit extra. We're not talking about pieces of apple pie. We're talking about real money. I can make a loan, says Rav, to my little boy. They say, here, I'll make a loan to my son, Yehuda Dov. He's 6 years old, whatever. Here is $10. You'll pay me back $11. And he says, but Abba, that hurts. He says, that's the whole point. I'm teaching you that it hurts. They have to pay back more, so that you'll learn that the ribbis is not a good thing. So how are you allowed to do that? How are you allowed to do such a thing? So Rashi says the following amazing comment. It's a yesod. It's a golden rule with respect to hilchos ribbis. It says Rashi, the havos mishalo, you're loaning from what basically belongs to you, and basically it is whatever comes, whatever they get really belongs to you. So they never get anything, which would not automatically go to the father anyway. So banu v'nei veiso asmucham al shulchano tekiman da'akom mishalo, because since everything is from him anyway, and it's not anything where they really have ownership of any money on their own, ein kan ribbis. So that's what Rashi says. Rashi says that if something never really leaves my possession, because it's going to the people who are smucham al shulchan, who have to give over everything from themselves to me anyway, so then there's no ribbis. So says Rashi, you could have a situation where it's a ribbis which is going from one person to a second person, but it's also permissible because it's all the same person, as long as the money never really leaves my possession, because it's just going to my small child. So then there's no ribbis in this situation either. That's what Rashi says. What does it mean lahatiman tam ribbis? So says Rashi, sheyedu kama kosher. They should know how difficult ribbis is. But what's the point that's being proven in the Gemara over here? Says Rashi, Alma kivin de mishalohu, since the money is all from his own, ain't kind issur ribbis. There's no ribbis over here, and therefore there's no problem with respect to with respect to any of the things that we've spoken about. There's no problem with respect to mida mishkal minyan because they're not makbid, and there's no problem as well with respect to loaning money or with respect to getting back a piece which is a bigger piece, because of the fact that it's not going to be a problem with ribbis because you're not getting back anything which is coming from somebody else. You're just getting back what essentially always belonged to you. But if that's the case, then as says the Gemara, if so, then you should be entitled, if it's a small child, if there's small children and nothing really belongs to them anyway, so then there shouldn't be any kind of an issur ribbis. It's all just basically the father's food, which is being distributed and reapportioned amongst all of the different children. So says the Gemara, you're right, that also will be mutter. Since we hold that right now the Gemara is assuming the halacha is like Rav Yona Reiss. Inachinami, v'chisuri machzor halacha kitani. Ma'apis adam b'nam beiso al shulchan. Afilu mana gedola keneged mana ketana. My timer, even if it's the bigger portions that go to the children, it's not a problem. They put in a small portion, they got back a big portion, no problem. My timer get Rav Yona Reiss in b'nam b'nei beiso in machevim lo. that we follow Rav Yehuda Marav, and therefore this is all going to be permissible with respect to one's own children, but not with respect to others. Why is it not going to be permitted with respect to others? So we gave all of these different reasons that are mentioned, and the Gemara throws in another one that says that even if I didn't hold that it would be a ribbis problem, and we see that ribbis is also going to be permissible with small children, but it would still be a problem, mishum kuvya, that it's like gambling, right? You don't know, you might end up with a smaller piece than what you put in, you might end up with a bigger piece, but you wouldn't necessarily put in with a gemiras das a bigger piece if you know you're going to get back only a smaller piece. So that's called kuvya, that's called a problem of gambling, of asmachta. So therefore that's not going to be permissible when it comes to other people, but with respect to your own children, all is fine, because nobody's losing anything. It all belongs to the balabas anyway. So it all belongs to the balabas anyway. So it seems over here that we have a precedent for this idea that if something never really loses, never really leaves a person's possession, so then it's going to all be permissible, because we have this yesod that whatever is mishalo is not ribbis. This is the Torah's Chaim also. Rav Shur uses a similar formulation. Mutal adam lahavos banu v'nei veso b'ribbis. He says that this is basically the din of Rav Yehuda Marav. We're not done. We're not necessarily going to keep this din at the end of the day. We might end up rejecting it. But so far, based on the Gemara and Shabbos, based on Rav Yehuda Marav, it's permissible. B'smuchum al Shulchan Ha'iri. We're talking about where basically they're all dependent upon the father. The kimin that call mishalo, since everything belongs to the father, even after it goes into their hands. Ein kan ribbis. There is no ribbis. There's no ribbis when you have a situation of a kol hu mishalo. So you would say, okay, fine. So if I have a similar situation, kal v'chomer, when I don't have two different gufim, when it's guf echad, when it's just the one person basically borrowing from themselves and paying back themselves, that for sure should be mutter. If it's mutter, even when I have two different people, but it's just that the money never really leaves the possession of the one who's the lender, because even after it goes to the borrower, it still is considered to be belonging to the lender. It's not going to have a problem of ribbis. So for sure, we've solved our problem, except that we see that this particular inyan doesn't necessarily survive the halacha. How do we paskin with respect to the mana gedola kenegin mana ketana? That happens to be a machlokes. The Shulchan Aruch brings two deos. The Shulchan Aruch says that when it comes to small children around your table, so even mana gedola kenegin mana ketana, according to one day it would be okay, but the first day that the Shulchan Aruch brings is that it's not going to be okay. The Rambam holds that mana gedola kenegin mana ketana is okay with small children. It's mashma from the Rif and the Rosh, who don't bring this din altogether. It's mashma they hold that it would not be okay. The Shulchan Aruch brings that as the main day. We'll get to that in a second. Take a look at the Ritva. The Ritva in source 9 over here on page 2, Maseches Bava Basra Daf Ayin Hey and Aleph. So the Ritva says like this. Oh, wait 1 second. Before we get to the Ritva, I'm sorry. So it's very important that we look at the Gemara in Bava Metzia. Gemara in Bava Metzia on Daf Ayin Hey and Aleph. That source 4 it says like this. He says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav. This is the main place where the halacha appears. This is our sugya nezo neshech. But then we have finally the bottom line. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is v'lav milsehi. The bottom line is that even though that is what Rav Yehuda Marav stated, nonetheless that is not the bottom line halacha. Why is it not the bottom line halacha? Mishum da asi the misrach. Because we're worried that the children are going to go astray. Namely, what's going to happen? That they're going to become so enamored of this idea that you can end up receiving more money if you loan ribbis. So even though they were the ones, according to the way that Rashi learned, they're the ones who ended up getting stung over here. Nonetheless, because of the fact that they see that you can actually gain something from it, because the father is making more money than what he originally gave them. So says the Rashi, I don't have this in the source materials, so I'll just read it to you, that we're worried that lahagil shiach mod liba maschar, that they're going to have a desire to be able to make this profit, that they can make more money because they see how much the other guy is getting. They see the father is getting more than what he originally extended. So therefore, says Rashi, that the bottom line is that we're not going to allow this. They might fall in. They might get pulled in. even though the father intended to give them good chinuch, Sheyeda kama mitzvah meitzer anosno v'yavinu kama onsho gadol, that they'll see how difficult it is that they have to end up giving more. So they'll say, this is like a very, very bad thing to do. So therefore we're going to avoid ribbis when we get older. But no, the pernicious effects of doing something that you're not, something naughty, even once, even if you're on you're on the receiving end of the naughty act, is that you might think, hey, if I get my act together and I figure out, how to get enough money, I could be on the other side of the transaction, and then I can bully the other guys. So therefore, it's sort of a danger. Sometimes the person who's bullied when they're younger, so then they become like a tzaddik, yesod olam, gadol hador, because they know how important it is to be compassionate to others. And sometimes the person who's bullied when they're younger says, I'm going to get back at the world. I'm going to get back at the world. It's like origin of the super, villains, whatever. The person's bullied when they were a young child. So then they decide that they're going to be villainous, when they get older. So you have to worry about Dilma Asi the Misrach. So Lamaisa, how do we paskin? Are we concerned or are we not concerned? So if you take a look at the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shincha Beis in Hilchos Shabbos, so here he's not talking about the ribbis, but he brings, as I mentioned, both of these deos regarding whether if you're dealing with the small children, whether you are allowed to apportion a mana gedola keneged mana katana, because it would seem that these two things go together, right? If I really do have a concern about ribbis, I should have a concern about mana gedola keneged mana katana, because we said that the bnei beso, once we established that ribbis is not a problem for bnei beso, the Gemara's next line was ihaki mana gedola keneged mana katana nami. So am I at the end of the day going along with the mana gedola keneged mana katana, or am I not going along with it? So the first day in the Shulchan Aruch says, no. Valite mana gedola keneged mana katana lahatzil goro lev afilu b'nei beso v'chol aser. Bishum kuvya says that it's going to be a problem of kuvya. Kuvya is only a d'rabbanan problem. Gambling problem, somebody who is not the Rambam Paskins only is considered to be a d'rabbanan problem. So if I'm going to be machmir with respect to kuvya kavachomer, I'm going to be machmir with respect to ribbis, which is a deraisa problem. However, then he brings the yeshom. The yeshom happens to be the Rambam in Perikov Gimel and Hilchos Shabbos. For yeshomim the imbanu v'nei beis mutal hatil go. Afilu mana gedola keneged mana katana. No, that would be okay. Why is it okay? There's no hakpada. If I'm worried about the kuvya problem, there's no hakpada. So therefore, it's not a problem of somebody not having a requisite gemiras das, and we don't seem to be goes there at all. So you have to wonder whether it's going to be a problem in a ribbis context, right? Okay, so that's says the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah, when he talks about that the yeshomim, this mekel, even in the case of mana gedola keneged mana katana, so the Mishnah Berurah magically brings back this lashon of Rashi that Rashi had mentioned in connection with the reason why Rav Yona Reiss had said that me'ikar adin there isn't really a problem of ribbis. He says, because everything really comes from one source. It's not coming from themselves, it's coming from the Father. None of these things you have to worry about. It's only if the pieces happen to belong to the children, somehow they had ownership of it themselves, okay, so then you would have a problem. But if they didn't belong to them, it all came from the Father, so then everything is going to be hunky-dory. But of course, we're not going to paskin that this is going to be permissible in the ribbis context, because the Gemara in Bava Metzia is the bottom line. That's the main sugya when it comes to hilchos ribbis. It says that we don't allow milsi mishum da'asi the misrach. So the Beis Yosef, this is the top source on page 2, source 8. Beis Yosef says that you need to understand it's not mi'ikar adin. It's a dilma asi the misrach concern. Mi'ikar adin, we would assume that the reasons that we gave, this idea, this foundational idea of hilchos ribbis, mishum shakol mishalo, that it all belongs to the Father anyway, that's good enough to be matir everything. That's good enough to be matir the ribbis. Once that's mutter, so then really, I didn't have to be machmir. What am I worried about? Dilma asi the misrach. Dilma asi the misrach is something for me to worry about in the realm of hilchos ribbis. It's not something that I need to worry about in the realm of kuvya, which is a lower level, issur, d'rabbanan, that I don't have to worry about as much. So that explains the second day. That would explain the day of the Rambam. That's how the Maggid Mishnah explains the Rambam. And Beis Yosef, he start out, he gives both sides of the coin. both sides of the coin. As I said, the main day that he quotes in Shulchan Aruch is the one that says you should be machmir. But he points out it doesn't have to go together. Even though we reject this halacha l'maaseh is paskin in Gemara Bava Metzia, is paskin in Hilchos ribbis, in Siman Kuf Samech Sifches, is that we do not allow it. He says that's the only a chumrah. Kimin delo nitches el mishum duma asi l'seruche amid de midina leki sur mnei shakol shelo. Midina, there's no issur. Why is there no issur? There's no issur mnei shakol shelo, because there's no issur to pay ribbis to yourself. So even if it's coming from a different person, a different entity, there's no issur to pay ribbis to yourself. Therefore, you don't have to worry about getting unequal portions. So he says that therefore you could distinguish between the two. You could decide that once we reject Rav, we're going to reject that as well. However, you could distinguish between the two, as I mentioned, that as the Maggid Mishnah says, because one is Rabbanan and one is the case of Kuvia is only Rabbanan. Case of ribbis concern is the case of Deraisa, so that would be a reason to be more machmir about that. So l'maaseh, it's a very are we concerned or not? So you take a look at the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos ribbis. What does it say? It says afilu levana v'bnei veiso asal havos b'ribbis. Even for you, with respect to your sons, your bnei veiso, let's say daughters, you're not allowed to lend b'ribbis. Even though, now this is interesting, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't mention the words apopi shakohu mishalo. It says apopi she'enu makpid aleim, which is the discussion that we had with respect to the mana gedol and mana katana. It says apopi she'enu makpid aleim uvadei nosan lehem b'matana. A totally new consideration that's coming into the picture that he's giving. Certainly, it's all being given as a matana. What's being given by matana? What's being given by matana? I don't understand. I'm loaning money to my small children, and they're giving me ribbis. They're not giving me the ribbis per matana. I can guarantee you, a father gives matanas to a child to a parent, not the same thing. The child is not going to be as pleasantly disposed, or is giving a little bit extra if he doesn't really want to the father. It means when the father originally gave it was per matana. We'll see different interpretations of uvade nosno matana, but it could be that it's out of place. Let's go back for a second to this idea of the hakolhu mishalo. So I wanted to just bring the ritva into the picture. So the ritva says like this. The ritva says, this is source 9, daf ayin hey amid aleph. He says, mutar lahadin lahavos lavanav v'nei veiso b'ribbis k'dei la'atim and dam ribbis. Ritva assumes we're talking about loaning to your small children. He says it's mutar. Perish mai b'smuchan al shulchan. We're talking about when they're dependent upon him on the table. They eat from his food. Because whatever they're giving him extra, it's all his anyway. So no ribbis in such a case. So that he wants to teach them how bitter ribbis is, as was mentioned, so that they shouldn't do it when they get older. And we say you shouldn't do it because they might fall in, they might get caught up with it. So then said the Ritva, we mentioned this in passing last time, that the Ritva derives a halacha l'maaseh from this. He says like this. He says, let's say I have a situation where I'm just collecting my own stuff, and I don't have a duma asin l'misrach concern. Let's say it's not a duma asin l'misrach, where I'm not worried that there's going to be a misimpression amongst small children. Everyone knows what the deal is. What's a situation like that? So he gives you a classic situation. It's just paskins. So the Bris Yehuda paskins like this. Ritva halacha l'maaseh. It's like this. That I know that Shimon stole money from me. Shimon has $10 of my money, and that he stole from me, or Shimon borrowed Shimon owes me, let's say, forget borrowing, although he's talking about that too, but we'll make it easier. Shimon owes me $10 because I fixed his car and he was supposed to pay me $10. He didn't pay me the $10. So either he stole the $10, he didn't pay me the $10 that he owes me, and I know I'm not going to be able to get the money from him. I have a brilliant idea. Shimon needs he needs a loan. So I say to Shimon, great, I'm going to make you a loan of $100, but you know what? You're going to pay me back $110. You're going to pay me back the $100 for the loan, and I'm only giving you the loan. Tonight you're going to give me back the $10 that you stole from me, or the $10 that you owe me for something else. It looks a lot like a ribbis transaction, but we say, since hakol mishalo, The extra $10 I'm collecting, that's not the revach, the profit that could be made on the money. That's money he owes me anyway. It's money he owes me anyway. So that's the situation. It's not Dilma Osin the Misrach. He's going to now feel, I see that ribbis is something which is permissible, and now I'm going to collect ribbis myself. I see how hard it hurts to pay this extra money. He's not hurting hard because he's paying extra money. He didn't pay any extra money. He knows that the money that he's paying me is money that he owes me anyway. And I know the money I'm collecting is money that he owes me anyway. So nobody's Dilma Osin the Misrach over here. No small children are going to have any misimpressions. Whenever I don't have a Dilma Osin the Misrach consideration, and it's just the same thing that it's a ribbis, Bino, leben, עצמו, says the Ritva that we learned from this sugya is going to be perfectly permissible. I'm not talking about the local case of Lahavos, Lebanov, Bnei Beiso, ribbis. It's teaching me a broader general principle in Hilchos ribbis. That if it's Hakol Mishalo, that it's ribbis, Bino, leben, עצמו, and I don't have the concern of Dilma Osin Misrach, then it's going to be mutter. So he says that that's what you could do. Mutter lahavos lo in this particular case. Amanashi parolo oso gezel ochov she'ein kan ribbis klal. To mind the mosif lei lov mididei hu diyoiv lei. Because whatever the lova is giving him is from the malva. It belongs to the malva himself. But the diyoiv lei b'zeh bar, and he says, and don't ask any kashas. Don't look funny at me. He says, don't ask any kashas. Zeh bar. This is 100% clear. That's what the Ritva says. That's what he says. Zeh bar. Where does this come from? I'm going to tell you is another sugya that says this beferish. You look at the sugya, you look at the way the explanation of Rashi in the sugya. It's a sugya in Bechoros. Daf Tez Zayin. I'm Aleph going over to Daf base. That's the sugya of Makabel Son Barzel. What's the Makabel Son Barzel case? That's the case of Makabel Son Barzel. I receive iron sheep. Iron sheep. They're not iron sheep. They're sheep. But they're like iron because of the fact that I have this absolute unconditional responsibility with respect to them. I receive some sheep from the Ovi Kochavim, and I have to pay back the value of the sheep. The sheep might live, the sheep might die, whatever happens to the sheep, I am obligated to pay back. It's like, when the next Son Barzel. Next Son Barzel that a husband gets from the dowry that the wife brings in, he has to pay back the value. Whatever happens to the Nechasim doesn't matter. We appraise the value at the time of the wedding. Eventually the husband's going to have to pay back that value, whether it goes up in value, down in value, doesn't matter. Same thing with respect to the sheep. But there's more with respect to the sheep, which is that part of the deal, when I got the sheep from the Ovei Kochavim, is not only do I have to return the value of the sheep after a certain number of years, but I am also obligated to split the offspring. These sheep are going to give birth to more sheep. It's a beautiful thing. That's how God runs the world, that the sheep propagate and the more sheep. Look at Yaakov Avinu, they'll be spotted and speckled and streaked and who knows what. Okay, and I'll have lots of sheep, but I'm going to split the sheep. I keep 50% of the sheep, and I give 50% of the sheep to the Yakum. Now, it sounds a little bit like ribbis because I'm obligated to pay back a set amount, plus I'm splitting the sheep. It could be that maybe the sheep are not going to have it. They're going to split the offspring. Could be they're not going to have offspring, but it's still going to be at least tzadachad b'ribbis, right? Which might be a deraisa too. But I'm going to have to pay it. I'm going to have to pay it back. It's very much like ribbis. But then there's a confusing part of this halacha. What's the confusing part of this halacha? V'ladosein peturin, that the offspring are patur mina bechorah. How are the offspring patur mina bechorah? If they're my offspring, the offspring of my sheep, so they're not patur mina bechorah. They're only going to be patur mina bechorah if they belong to the akum. So it says the Gemara, there's a clear understanding here that if they're patur mina bechorah, that means that they still belong to the akum. But how can such a thing be? Says the Gemara, the Mema the Kimid lo nakam arazuzi b'shusa damara kaima. You mean that you're telling me that because I didn't, pay for these sheep from the Akum when I received them, I just have an obligation that I have to pay a certain amount after a certain number of years. So now they still are considered to be in the possession of the non-Jew. If they're still in the possession of the non-Jew, I have a problem here. Because the halacha is you could be makabel son barzel of this type of a transaction in Ovei Kochavim, but you can't be makabel son barzel from a Yisrael. Why can't I be makabel son barzel from a Yisrael? As I pointed out, it's ribbis, right? It's ribbis. But wait a second. If the offspring of patur mina bechorah, that means that we still treat it as if it's owned by the original owner. If it's still owned by the original owner, you can't have ribbis in such a situation. Because lo asur Torah la ribbis abad milov l'malveh. You can't have ribbis Beino leben עצמו. That's what the Gemara says. It just doesn't use my terminology. U'reminu ein mekabelin son barzel mi Yisrael mipnei shehu ribbis alma b'shusa the mekabel kaima. So that indicates that it really is considered like it's transferred. It's a possession from the original owner to the recipient of the iron sheep. So says Abaye says no. we have to understand under what circumstances would it still be in the possession of the original owner if the original owner still maintains responsibility. If the animals would get into a car accident, they're crossing the road. Why did the iron sheep cross the road? I don't know, but it got struck by a truck, and now that's the end of all of the iron sheep. So in that case, if the original owner says, well, now you don't have to pay me back anymore because a terrible accident occurred, because I take responsibilities for accidents, or if it went down in value, then you don't have to pay me the original value. So then if he takes that responsibility of unsa d'zula, so then we understand that it belongs to the Yaakam. When is it also to take son barzel from the Yisrael? That's when the Yisrael did not accept upon himself and continue to maintain the responsibility of unsa v'zula. So Amalei of Abba, so Abba said, what are you talking about? The original owner accepted unsa v'zula. To Kabbalah unsa v'zula tzon barzel kareslei. That's an iron sheep, but then you have a way out of having to pay back the sheep. And also, instead of having this distinction between the fact that the Mishnah, the Brisa says you're not mekabel tzon barzel from Yisrael, but you are mekabel tzon barzel min ovi kochavim liflog litnim b'didal. You can have a simpler distinction. When is it that you are not mekabel tzon barzel min ha'akum? Min ha'Yisrael. When is it you can't do it min ha'Yisrael? That's when the Yisrael did not, the original owner did not accept the responsibility. So therefore, Rava says no. The case of Mekabel Son Barzel is where the original owner does not maintain any responsibility. And that's why it's issur to take it from a Yisrael, because it no longer belongs to the original owner. If the original owner relinquishes all responsibility with respect to the animals, so that it's out of his possession, and then I have a regular milva, I have a regular milva transaction, in which case there would be a problem of ribbis. So why then is the animal p'tuim in mechara? It's a local din of hilchos b'chor behema tahora. Don't ask me. It has to do with the fact that there's yad ovi kochavim behemsa. Special din. Yad ovi kochavim behemsa. He wants to collect his money. The Jew doesn't have the money. He's going to take his animals. If the animals aren't enough for him to get his money, he's going to take the offspring of the animals. And therefore, he's still going to be involved with the actual animals itself. That's a din of yad ovi kochavim behemsa. Nothing to do whatsoever with ownership. Local din when it comes to hilchos b'chorim. But not when it comes to ribbis. When it comes to ribbis, we have a very simple formula. If the original owner is out of the picture with respect to responsibility, so then I have a haval transaction. If the original owner is still in the picture, because he maintains responsibility on v'zula, okay, so then we can talk. Then we might have a hakol hu mishalo type of situation, in which case it wouldn't be a ribbis problem. And basically that becomes the halacha. This explains to us very well. If you look at Rashi on the Gemara in Bechoros, Rashi in the Gemara in Bechoros says like this, Daf Tezayim Beis. He says that the mekabel kaima, if in fact the original owner did not retain any responsibility, so then it was transferred over to the recipient, and then there should be a ribbis problem. Why? The mekabel zuzi hu dechayav lehu v'ayde shakol nosein chatziv lados, and that the fact that the original owner is now going to receive back his original money, the value of the animals, plus he's going to get half of the offspring. B'scharam tonas mos kashakalu. He's getting it because he's waiting time to receive the monetary value back. So that's called agunater, and therefore that's a problem of ribbis. Because if the animals were still considered to be in the possession of the original owner, says Rashi, amai ribisu. He's explaining the kasha of the Gemara. Why would it be ribis? Beshuse demari ashbach vlodos. The offspring all just added value and profit while the animals were still in the ownership of the original person. That's not considered to be ribbis. Did you ever stop to think for a second why it's okay for me to collect money, okay, when I'm getting more money back if I loan you my shovel? I loan you my shovel, okay? I rent out my shovel to you. And I say, you can keep my shovel for 2 weeks, and after the 2 weeks, what do I want back? I want my shovel. Of course you want back your shovel. Why not? That's a legitimate transaction. Oh, and pay me $100 because you rented my shovel. What do you mean, ribbis? Ribbis. You loan me a shovel, I'm giving you back the shovel, plus I'm giving you back value. Why is that permissible? Why is any type of schiras transaction not a problem of ribbis? Why is it that schiras is perfectly fine? The answer why schiras is perfectly fine is because it never left the original possession of the owner. It never left the possession of the owner because the owner maintains responsibility. That's why it's perfectly fine. There's a wonderful formulation, if I can find it, to explain exactly how this works, the halacha, which is like this. This is the formulation of the Sefer Seder ribbis. I love this when he's just explaining sort of the basic yesod as to why schivus doesn't provide a problem with respect to ribbis. You have a similar formulation in the Hagdama of the Nesiva Sholem to Hilchos Ribbis as well, but I think it's said even a little bit sharper by this Sefer. When it comes to halva, so the money, the item is going completely to lova. He could do whatever he wants. He has full responsibility, and he's dealing with his own item, and now he's paying you a premium. That's ribbis. So now he's paying extra for basically what was rightfully his, what he took full responsibility for, and now he's paying an extra premium. Ribbis, that's the definition of ribbis. When it comes to schirus, when it comes to schirus, why is that not a problem? Because the socher is utilizing the object that belongs, still belongs to the original owner. The original owner is going to have to suffer any depreciation of the object. If I'm dealing with, for example, something that has bechas, and that's why the maskir is allowed to take money for the shimush. If I would rent you money, technically speaking, if I would rent you money and I would maintain full responsibility with respect to that which I'm renting you, and it's not going to be lahotza nitna, because I'm only going to rent you the money for you to be able to show off the money. You have a big parlor meeting in your house, okay? And you want to be able to show people that, you're good for being able to raise money for the yeshiva. Say, look, I have a suitcase full of dollar bills here. I have a suitcase that I rent to people that has $1 million in it, okay? And then they have to give it back to me afterwards. So he's showing off. All the donors are coming there. Why? Look, I have a suitcase of $1 million. You should also give to the yeshiva. Whatever he's going to use it for. Okay, so so people rent it out. They want it, and then they give it back to me afterwards. But if I'm renting out my suitcase with $1 million of dollar bills, so I want $150 a shot. Okay, and people are happy to pay that to me. Is that permissible? 100% permissible. It's not l'hotzon, and I have to maintain a certain measure of responsibility. In this particular case, we're talking about money. That was Rav Chama's mistake. Rav Chama thought that he can rent out money. He maintains, a certain amount of responsibility. It's going to be, okay. We say the Vilna Gaon said he made a big mistake in that respect. Money is a different story if it's going to be l'hotzon nitna. But if it's not l'hotzon nitna, so then you would even be allowed to rent out money. Why? Because it's not about money. It's about, am I loaning it? It goes fully into the possession of the borrower, or am I just renting something? So with money, because it's l'hotzon, it's generally going to be a problem. Even when you take the original owner takes a certain measure of responsibility, unless it's l'hotzon, unless it's not l'hotzon, and he's going to take some responsibility as well. But you could even conjure up a case, as I'm pointing out, where even with money it would be potentially okay. That Rav Chama made the mistake of thinking even l'hotzon would not be a problem. So that he made it. So the Gemara says he made a mistake. That's the Gemara. Amud base. But this is a very important yesod. This explains as well why schivus is perfectly permissible. It explains so much about hilchos ribbis. It explains heteriska. Why is heteriska okay? Why do we, do something that's essentially a loan transaction? Looks like a loan transaction. Everybody drew up the loan documents and so forth, and they're about to close, and suddenly somebody says, "Oh, give out! We forgot the heteriska." So he said, "Oh, heteriska. I'm going on the computer. Beth in America here, print it out. Heteriska. They sign it. Everything's good. Why did everything suddenly become good? What? They just sprinkled magical pixie dust over the transaction. It looks like a loan transaction because you look at the heteriska. Heteriska explains that we're reclassifying the transaction. It's no longer a loan transaction. It's half a loan. Okay, half of it is going to be a loan. The person who extended that is not going to be entitled to profits with respect to the loan. Of course not. That would be ribbis. But half of it is a pikadon. Half of it is a deposit. What is a deposit? It means the one who's extending it still maintains responsibility. If it's going to get lost, if this iska, the investment, the items that are going to be invested in are going to go sour, they're going to go south, they're going to tank, so then he's not going to get anything back. from that portion of the money. He'll just lose his shirt to lose that portion of the money. 50% of the investment we lost, and it's only with respect to 50% of the total profits relating to the 50% that relates to the Kollel portion. Only that portion of the profit is going to go to the person, and if we can't prove how much it was because we need witnesses and an oath and all that, so we'll stipulate that we're going to presume that there's a certain amount of profit. If we knew for sure that there wasn't, we had an undecided, so he still wouldn't be entitled to any money. That's the whole idea. Why is that? Because the pikadon portion of the heter iska is hakol hu mishalo. It still remains in the possession, in the ownership of the original extender of the money, of the investor, and therefore when he's getting money back, extra money back, it's considered to be profit on his own money, okay? Because that is the same very principle of the hakol hu mishalo. So we see there's a lot of hilchos ribbis that really depends upon this notion. Sometimes it's going to work out, even when, like in a case of schirus, even when I have multiple individuals. But certainly, even if it's a regular monetary transaction, if the money itself is hakol mishalo, the money never left my possession, it never left my possession, it never left my ownership, even if it's traveling around, because of the fact that it always remains my money. So that's also going to be permissible under those circumstances if it always remained my money. Now, the thing is that we say we're not permitting it when it's a dilma asi lemisrach situation. It's a very interesting question, because what case is dilma asi lemisrach? So I gave you a simple reading of the Gemara. I gave you a very simple reading of the Gemara. Simple reading of the Gemara is that the father is alone. That's how Rashi seems to learn the Gemara. You would have to be very creative to explain that Rashi is giving you a different explanation than that which we read Rashi is saying, right? But there are such creative people out there, believe it or not. But but it seems like we're talking about father is loaning money to small children giving him that money back, which really was always his anyway, with a little bit of ribbis. We say he wants to teach them the severity of ribbis. Now, really, Meker Din is going to be mutter. Maybe because Meker Din is mutter, will still be Mekel on Monik Gedola Ketagin Monik Tana, like the Rambam holds. Maybe we won't be Mekel about that, but Meker Din is mutter. And we just have this Gezerah, Dilma Asi Lemisrach. What exactly is the case? We have a big machlokis as to what the case really is in terms of how we paskin. If you look at the Rambam is a little bit cryptic in terms of how the Rambam describes the case. The Rambam, this is source 14, in the Perek Dal Halacha Ches of Hilchos Malve Velove. Says the Rambam, Asal Adam lahalvos banu v'nei veso b'ribbis. The Rambam says you're not allowed lahalvos. Lahalvos means what? To loan or to borrow? Anybody?
To lend.
Of course it means to lend. Like, what's even the havamina otherwise? But there were such havaminas. It says it's to lend. Asla adam lahalvos, to lend. But he doesn't say. Does he say to whom you're lending? Does he say to whom you're lending? Does the Rambam tell you to whom you're lending the money?
He's lending to children.
Does he say?
Sort of.
Sort of. He sort of says, but he doesn't actually say. He doesn't say to whom. To whom would be le. He doesn't say le. He says banu v'nei veso. So of course, if it's just banu v'nei veso, they could be the subject, they could be the object, right? I can move things around, right? I could say asal adam, namely to allow banu v'nei veso lahavos b'ribbis. Okay, potentially, because he didn't have the word le. The Rambam left out a letter, so maybe it was very purposeful. He left out the letter. Also, adam lahavos banu v'nei veso b'ribbis avav b'sheinu makbid umatanu sheno sein lahen. And it sounds a lot that way from the Rambam, because the Rambam doesn't talk about a kol mishalo. He says matanahu. What matana? Matana, as I said, that if I'm borrowing money from somebody, so then we have a whole discussion. If I give it back money and I give back a little bit extra and I say, oh, it's a matana, no problem, so is that going to be considered to be permissible? So we say no, because it's just like a haram, really you intend to do ribbis. But we actually do allow that. We allow it with Tamei Chachamim. That's the Shulchan Aruch Siman Kuf Zamen Sifri Yud Zayin. Tamei Chachamim Shehilvu Zed Dvarim Shemacha V'Nasan Lo Yosef Mashalavim Menu Ad Chomesh Harei Zemuta Shedava Yadua Shlo Nasan Lo Ela Matana. Certainly, if they're dealing with items as opposed to money, this would be permissible for Tamei Chachamim. Nowadays, we assume, who's such a Tamei Chacham? If I borrow money and I'm a Tamei Chacham, who says the lender is a Tamei Chacham, right? Or vice versa. If he's a Tamei Chacham, who says that I'm a Tamei Chacham. So it's we don't rely upon this by and large. But there's such a concept. If we knew bona fide for sure that it was being given as a matana, so then it would be okay. So I understand if the father borrows the money, maybe when he's paying it back, that it's a real matana, because the father really is very, very kind-hearted and generous when it comes to his own children. But then it sounds a little bit like he's the borrower and not the lender. So it says says, "Hareza also shema yagilem davar zeh." But it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If we're worried that the children are going to become regulated in terms of ribbis, so it's more likely they're going to become regulated when they benefit from it, when they're actually the recipients of the ribbis. So then they're more likely to say, "This is geschmack. This is geschmack. I gave $10, I got back $11. I want to keep on doing this. This is really good. This is fun." Okay, but if they got, but if they basically receive $10 and they have to give back $11, that's much less geschmack. But that's what the Rambam indicates, that, Shema Yagilem do davar zeh. So it sounds a little bit that way. So who says that? Who says that within the Rambam? Who says that within the Rambam? A couple of people say within the Rambam. The Gedulei Truma says it within the Rambam. And the Gedulei Truma also says it within the Sefer Truma, for that matter. And the Taz, a force to be reckoned with. The Taz is on the page. He's on the page of the Shulchan Aruch, right there. So you can't go. This is how the Taz understands the Halacha. It's how the Taz understands the Halacha of the Rambam. How the Taz understands the Halacha and the Shulchan. You believe such a thing? So I wouldn't waste your time if it was something from outer space. But it's a Taz. It's a Taz. So the Taz here, okay, Hilchos Ribbis, Siman Kuv Samech, Sif Ches, Sif Katan Daled. So he says, Afil Levanav. So he says at the beginning it sounds a little bit. In the Shulchan Aruch, he says the Shulchan Aruch has the Lamed. Shulchan Aruch, it's hard to interpret the Shulchan Aruch like the Rambam, because the Shulchan Aruch has the Lamed. Shulchan Aruch says, Afil Le. That's much more difficult to play around with, right? Much more difficult to play around with. But it says the Taz like this. It says, Masha Shem Lovim Menamos, Nosim Lo Ribbis. He says, so what does it mean when it says, Uvaide Nosim Lam B'matana? He also has that problem. So there are a couple of different interpretations of what it could mean. It could mean that at the time that he is giving it, he's giving it as a matana to his children, so he never intended it as a loan in the first place. That's what the Mishnah Lamelech says. The Mishnah Lamelech gives that pshat within the Rambam, that b'shas hava, he's giving it to them as a matana. The Prisha has two other potential explanations of what nosei lahem b'matana means if I'm talking about the father being on the lending end of the transaction, and the Taz quotes both of them himself. He says one of them is that he decides that he's going to treat it like a matana. So when it comes time for the father to collect the money from his children, he says, I was just kidding about that extra money. I wanted you to feel, some of that anxiety of having to pay the extra money. Of course, I wouldn't collect that extra, that $11 from you. I loan you $10. You don't have to give me back the $11. Now give me back the $10. No, I don't know if he would say that much either. Father probably wouldn't even collect the $10. But certainly he's not going to collect the $11. That's not happening. That's the other possibility. No sin lam matana. For sure, the ribbis amount is going to be no sin lam matana. Third explanation is that he takes it. He says, I took that $11. And he sees the child's crying. Yeah, you're crying. Now you know what it's like to ribbis. Okay, good. Lesson taught. Here's the money back. And then he gives it back afterwards. So he's giving it as a matana afterwards. So based on one of these, he always had in mind to do that. Since he always had in mind to do that, so therefore it's nothing to discuss in terms of the realm of ribbis. But nonetheless, we still say we're still not going to allow it because Dilma Asil Misrach. So those are the three different ways that you can explain it. The Taz is not buying it. Taz says no. Matana sounds like when the money is being paid back, and the ribbis is being paid, the person paying the ribbis is giving it as a matana. That can't be going on the children. He said, Dochek leparish came. Rambam Kollel the yesheno makpid, and the Rambam even uses a lashon that he's not makpid. That's what the Rambam says. The Rambam says that afabi she'eno makpid matana hu shenosin lehen. It sounds like he's not makpid about having to pay the extra amount. So it sounds like he's really the borrower. Okay, so therefore he says. Mashma shehu no sein lahem ribbis. Ela she'ein b'nesina zu issur shematana bi'amahu, just like the case of Talmidei Chachamim. And he says that's the explanation of the Levush. That's the way that the Gedulei Truma understands the Sefer Truma as well. And he says that is in fact the lashon of the Levush asla halvos mi banav. So you can't make it any clearer. The Rambam was a little coy. He just said banav. He didn't say libanav, he didn't say mibanav. But the Levush says mibanav. You know who else says explicitly that we're talking about a loan transaction from the children as opposed to the children? None other than our good friend, the Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi, source 20. Okay, Maseches Bava Metzia, Parakeh Halacha Hey says like this: Lova Adam mi banav. This is Yerushalmi. A person is allowed to borrow from his children. Mi banav. Uvenosa beribis. Ela shemechanchen beribis, because he's training them with respect to ribbis. And the continuation also seems to indicate that maybe the heter over here would be that he's really just giving it, b'matana at the end, because the other example that's given of what would be permissible are Talmidei Chachamim borrowing from each other and giving back a little bit extra, right? Because they're giving it as matana. Rav could go on the Rabba Babachana, Rabba Babachana Li. It would be a similar sort of thing. The Yedid Nefesh, Perish, Arne, the Yerushalmi, that says like this. Lav adam mibanav b'nosav ribbis klomar. He can borrow from his sons and daughters. Me'ikar din ein issur ki es ribbis no sein lehem b'matana, because he's giving it as a matana. Ela asu kakam lasos to be shimachan kam b'ribbis. The Gidulei Truma has this fascinating diuk within the Rambam. He says that we can be medayik this way in the Rambam because of the fact that the Rambam didn't use the word es or the letter lo. Since he just said lahavos banav uvnei beso beribis, but he didn't say le banav uvnei beso. So and he talks about the reason is because he's giving us a matana. So that's a proof that he says that this is pshat within the Rambam. And then he goes even further and he says that he thinks that this is what Rashi meant as well. I have a hard time understanding that this is what Rashi meant as well. But he says that this is his interpretation of Rashi on the Gemara, despite the fact that Rashi on the sugi in the Gemara, when he spoke about this loan transaction, sounded very much like it was coming from the father to the children. But he says no. This is the idea when Rashi says that they're going. We're worried Dilma Asi lemisrach because of the fact that they're going to feel this tremendous excitement with respect to ribbis, that they're going to be chomed the ribbis lahagil shiachmo the libam haskar. So he says that's because when they see the tremendous tsar that the father is going to have when he gives them the ribbis, so they're going, that also will enable kivan shehem yitamu skara kabbalah mehanos hakabbalah yargishu tsar and I'm sorry. It's understandable from the fact that Rashi says that they're going to feel geschmack, that they're the ones who are receiving the ribbis. But then what's then when Rashi said the reason why this is going to, why Rav Yona Reiss thought this was permissible is because he said that sheyeda kama mitztayro meitza hanosno v'yavina kama onsho gadol, that they'll understand how difficult it is, that tsar hanosno. So he's saying that when they get the geschmack of receiving it, so then they will understand that there's sort of the opposite end of the coin, is that the one who's giving it must be in a lot of tsar. Shekivan shem yitamu skara kabbalah mehanas ham-kabbalah yagishu tsar v'nesina ki yedias ha'afachim achas. Because knowing opposites is one thing, right? So if you're like very excited because your team won, so obviously you're feeling the suffering of the other side of how lousy they must feel that their team lost, right? Because that's just human nature, right? You gotta be tempered. Oh, but I feel so bad for the other side, right? That Charlie Brown sensibility. Okay, so so that's what the Gedulei Truma takes for granted. That's what he assumes. That's a very philosophical explanation of Rashi. I think that it's really a stretch. Most of them before Hashem will at least grant that that's not what Rashi had in mind. But certainly, if you understand like the Taz and you understand like the Gedulei Truma, so says the Pri Megadim, says the Perish Emek Davin, the Veisofim Hilchos Ribbis, they all point out something which is sort of, obvious. The Tchokos B'Yamin points to that as well. Pri Megadim has this Mishpat of Sifkat and Dal in Siman Kuf Samach. He says, you know what? If you really learn like the Taz, it's very possible that our case of Kivan Ze'akol Hu Mishalo, where it's really the father who's loaning the money to the small children beribis, maybe that would actually still be mutter. That's not what Rav Asad. What Rav Asad was only the case where the father was borrowing the money from the children of beribis, and in that case where they have the geschmack of receiving the ribbis, so we're worried that Dilma Asi lemisrach, but they're the ones who are paying the ribbis to their father. Maybe that's going to be perfectly okay. Even halacha l'maaseh, as at the end of the day, maybe that's actually going to be 100% mutter. Isn't that incredible? It's incredible that actually survives all of the discussions in Halacha throughout the centuries, but that actually survives, based on the explanation of the Taz. Now, it happens that the explanation of the Taz is clearly not accepted by everybody. The Prisha says explicitly that we can explain, we gave 3 different explanations based on the Prisha Mishnah Melech of what Kin Shenosin Lo B'Matana means, but the most creative solution is that of the Shach. The Shach has this wonderful solution. Look in the Nekudas HaKesef, source 23, you gotta love this, Siman Kuf Samach Sif Ches, where he says that this whole question of that maybe we'll interpret that the father, when he originally extended the loan, he was giving it b'hova. He says you don't have to get to any of that stuff. When the Shulchan Aruch says, "Uvavadai nosno lahem matana," the kasha of the Taz is a good kasha. Uvavadai nosno lahem matana means that the father is paying back the ribbis b'matana. He says the Shulchan Aruch has 2 different cases. There's the reisha and there's the seifa. The reisha is afilu b'anav b'nei veso asal lahavos b'ribbis, that even with respect to one's children, you're not allowed to loan b'ribbis. And then he says, and in addition to that, you have to add 3 words. Now, I don't know if the Shach had the 3 words, or the Shach is saying it's ki'ilu, you have the 3 words, but he says you have to add the 3 words. He says, perusho kepshuto. The beginning of the Shulchan Aruch, where it says that lahavos, don't switch around words on me, b'nei beso, before the lahavos instead of after the lahavos. Lahavos means lahavos. It means that you're lending. You're the one who's lending, you're not the one who's borrowing. That's case number 1. But then he says that then we have a case number 2, which is v'chein lelavos mehem. And similarly, the father is also not allowed to borrow from the children, despite the fact that despite the fact that he's happy for them to have the money, and he's certainly, just like the case of the Talmidei Chachamim, he's certainly giving it to them b'matana. Nonetheless, he says that under these circumstances, we're still worried about Dima Asi L'Misrach. Says the Shach, encoded into the Shulchan Aruch is actually both cases. It's actually both cases. An incredible thing, incredible insight. Now, what about the other end of the coin? The way in which we're understanding is like the parish of the Shach, right? Namely that at the very least, the halacha includes the case where the father is also lending to the children, and we're still going to prohibit that based on il dilma asi l'misrach. Well, what if it's not going to be a dilma asi l'misrach situation for another reason? Namely, and I leave this as an open question, namely that he's not dealing with the smaller children, but he's dealing with the older children. He's dealing with older children. So the Sefer Truma says, "V'chein asu chachamim lahavos b'ribbis banu v'nei beso ketanim." That it's with respect to ketanim that we're worried about, that it's going to lead to bad chinuch if you're going to do this. The kaven shein ketanim yagilu asma mekak b'kanusam yesh lachush. You have to be worried ki askin lo yosem menu v'yelem keheter, that they're going to treat it as a heter when they become older. So this is sort of an interesting question as to whether we would say then that in this particular case, if we have this diuk, which is an interesting diuk within the Sefer HaTruma, that some of the Meforshim point out that he says very explicitly that we're only talking about the ketanim. Now, I understand why we would only be talking about ketanim if we were talking about the heter, because the idea of the kivan she'akol hu mishalo makes sense only when I'm speaking about ketanim as opposed to gedolim, because if they're gedolim, so then whatever they're going to get is in fact going to belong to them, as opposed to when I'm talking about a case of gedolim. But if a possible heter is that it's known that this is really being given b'matana, and that's the reason why I'm going to be matir, but I say that I still have to be worried about dilma asi l'misrach, so then I don't have to be worried as much about the dilma asi l'misrach concern if I'm dealing with gedolim. Then there might actually be more room to be mekel, even in a situation where the father is loaning, where I have, let's say that forget about the Taz for a second, who says that the issur is only when it's being borrowed, but maybe if he's loaning, then it would be okay. If I understand the Sefer HaTrumas, the way that it's understood by the Gidulei Truma, where the Gidulei Truma says that the Sefer HaTrumos is talking about a situation where the father is borrowing the money from the children. So then I can say that for sure their age isn't going to make a huge difference in terms of any potential heter. It's only going to make a difference in terms of the issur, because the issur is dilma asi l'misrach. They're going to misunderstand. The heter is based upon the fact that the father is giving it as a matana. So maybe in that case, there's actually more room to be makel when the father is borrowing from banim and gedolim as opposed to banim ketanim. I haven't seen anybody say this beferish, but I'm just throwing it out there. If I'm going to have that potential interpretation of the case of when you're borrowing from if I'm understanding an issur, when the father was borrowing, and I'm understanding that's what the Sefer HaTrumos is talking about, and I understand that I have this diuk in the Sefer HaTrumos that it is only talking about ketanim and not talking about gedolim. So there is a potential diuk over here within the Sefer HaTrumos, and the Bris Yehuda actually mentions that as well in Ha'ara Ayin in Perek Beis in the Bris Yehuda Ayin Sham. So turning now to our situations, it seems to me that when you don't have this Dilma Asi in the Misrach situation, you don't have this issue where the Ritva even applied this to in a situation where you have a loan between two separate individuals. Certainly, if a person is borrowing from himself, then for sure it would seem that there is plenty of room to be makel. That it seems that this idea of the kol mishalo that we have established as such a foundational rule in all of Hilchos Ribbis should be one that would play out in terms of allowing for a heter when a person is borrowing from their S corporation and only paying back to themselves, when a person is borrowing from their pension account. Now, the poskim nowadays talk a lot about ribbis problems with pensions, which is probably incomprehensible to most of us. But there are long articles, including one in Chelik Lamed Vav of the Yeshiva Journal, about how nobody understands the terrible, terrible problems with respect to pension funds. And I was trying to figure out what they were talking about. What they really were talking about is the fact that you have somebody who's managing the pension funds, who's investing on your behalf, and you have to make sure that all the investments are basically kosher investments. So in Eretz Yisrael, it's a very, very big deal, because they assume that a lot of the money is going into like loans to Jewish people and Jewish entities where you don't have a proper heter iska and things of that variety. So now they're like what's called kosher pension accounts. Has anybody ever heard of this? Kosher pension accounts, where they make sure everything is vetted, that every single investment is only done when there are proper heter iskas and so forth. We generally don't worry about this so much, I think, in America, or at least I'm not under the impression that most people who put their money in 401ks and things like that are so worried about it, because we generally assume that you're investing in funds and stock portfolios and things like that are all completely owned and run by non-Jews and the like, and you're not investing in loans to specific Jewish parties. So we don't really worry about it so much. In fact, the solution that seems to be proposed by those who have written about it, it's the very long article that's in the Yeshiva Journal, which is authored by a Rav Yaakov Lando. So his solution seems to be just make sure that the investments are all in like mutual funds and things that are not, specific to an individual company that's owned by a Jew, or what he calls what's it called? The certificates of Sal. Okay, these are certificates of Sal, which are, I looked up sort of the translation of what they are, and they seem to be basically exchange-traded funds. Anybody familiar here with the notion of exchange-traded funds?
Yeah.
What?
Just a bundle of stocks.
So that's also basically, I think, a mutual fund, right? So those are, what? No? So what would those be? Help me out. They're called Tudo-Sal. Yeah.
It's you own a stock in something that buys stock in other.
So that's the idea, that the stock itself is, but that's like a diversified portfolio that it's buying.
Right, it's a
so
diversified portfolio.
So isn't that similar to just investing in a mutual fund, basically?
Very similar, yes. It's just publicly, it's just easier to get in and out of. Mutual funds, you're locked in longer. It's the same thing.
Okay, that's kach haya nirali as well. Thank you for that. So it seems to me that probably our pension funds, I mean, just knowing how I end up, making investments because generally we're given the choice to make whatever investments we want. That's why everybody has their own individualized, personalized mutual for pension portfolio, is that they generally are like mutual fund type of investments, investing in like this type of mutual fund, a little more aggressive, a little less aggressive, and so forth. So it would seem to satisfy, his concerns. When I read up from Investopedia is kind of like my guru when it comes to financial information. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most authoritative. It's probably a little bit more reliable than AI at this point. I don't know. So it says like this. It says, technically, unless it's written by AI, technically 401k loans are not true loans. They're not true loans because they do not require a credit check or lender's evaluation of their credit history. They are more accurately described as the ability to access a portion of your own retirement plan money. The loan amount you can borrow tax-free depends on your vested balance. You can borrow whichever is less than the greater of $10,000 or 50% of your vested account balance of $50,000 and so forth. And it's basically, and this is what Investopedia says itself. It says for a 401k loan, any interest charged on the outstanding loan balance is repaid by the participant into the participant's own 401k account. Technically, this is a transfer from one of your pockets to another, not a borrowing expense or loss. So that it seems that this is, in fact, at least according to Investopedia, a correct understanding of how it works, that you really are basically engaged in ribbis, Bieno, leben, עצמו. You know what the deal is. You know you're not really paying interest to anybody else. Nobody else is on the receiving end who thinks that they're receiving interest, especially since you're going to be double taxed anyway. So therefore, it seems like this is a case where we don't, and we're not dealing with katanim, hopefully. So this is a case where I don't think you need to worry about Dilma Asi Lemisrach. And based on my discussion, it would seem to me that you would be allowed, unless you find out something special about your own firm's pension portfolio, that really everybody shares in the money. It's like a corporation that everyone is together. But generally speaking, it doesn't seem like that really is the case. So it seemed to me, based on our discussion, that it would be permissible to take an interest loan from your own pension account and then to pay back the loan with interest without violating Hilchos Ribbis, not on a deraisa level and not on a derabanan level. And we will stop here. Okay.
Come on, next Thursday, right?
Next Thursday, what time do you want to get to work?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock? Okay. Great.
Those Hanukkah.
Okay, Freilich Hanukkah to everybody.
It doesn't. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Look at it. Although maybe it's not misguided, but to say that it was because of that a lot of conditions are now making a stop Chaburah with that pension.
Then what is the pikadon?
The pension, the money I invested in this, the money I put away.
How is the? You're saying that the 401k in general, you could say is a pikadon because of the fact that I have a possibility of like.